Good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin, I'd like to note that this call is being recorded. My name is Ron Halber, and I am the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. The JCRC serves as the public affairs and community relations arm of the organized Jewish community in our nation's capital. We represent the more than 100 organizations and synagogues throughout the region. A key component of our work is empowering, training, and mobilizing our community to engage with and advocate for Israel. Thank you to the more than 400 people from our region, Israel, and throughout the country who are joining us for today's webinar. I would also like to thank Alexis Schwartz and Adam Odesser, JCRC's Israel Action Center Director and Associate respectively, for arranging this webinar. On Wednesday, the leaders of Yesh Atid and the Yamina political parties, Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett, announced to the president that they have reached a unity government to form a coalition. They've reached a coalition government, putting Israel on the verge of having a new prime minister for the first time in 12 years. The government will have 3 right-wing parties, 2 centrist parties, 2 left-wing parties, and the first time an Arab party. What are the chances of this government to succeed? Is this the end of Israel's ongoing political deadlock? And what does this all mean for Prime Minister Netanyahu? To answer those questions and more, we are joined today by Lahav Harkov. Lahav is the senior contributing editor and diplomatic correspondent of the Jerusalem Post. She reports and analyzes Israel's relations with the world, the Prime Minister's office, the National Security Council, the Foreign Policy, the Foreign Ministry, and more. She lectures on Israeli government and politics and has been hosted by several international news outlets, including the BBC, France 24, and Sky News, to share her analysis on Israeli politics. Lahav will speak for 15 or 20 minutes or so, and then I'll follow up some questions and answers. And if anybody in our audience has any questions that they'd like to offer, please put it in the chat box. Lahav, thank you. Can you please thank you for joining us here today. And can you walk us through the developments over the past few weeks, how we got here, who the key players are, and if this group can agree on anything except the fact that they don't like Bibi Netanyahu?
So it seems like you really have to take someone back for 2 years to understand what's going on, but I will try to make as much sense as possible. But I am going to start 2 years ago, because on June 2nd, 2019, on the morning of that day, Israel's defense minister was Naftali Bennett and justice minister was Ayelet Shaked. And later that day, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu fired them both because they had run in an election a couple of months before, and their party did not pass the electoral threshold. There's a 3.25% threshold to get into the Knesset, and their party didn't make it in. It was very close. It was only by I think it was 1,500 votes that they didn't get in, but they didn't get in. And Netanyahu, who never liked these 2 politicians, fired them from his cabinet as he moved forward to try to build a government. Now, as you probably know, Netanyahu failed to build a coalition in that election, failed in the subsequent election. In a third election, he built what was called a unity government with his rival, Benny Gantz, and that lasted a very short time. And now we had our 4th election this year, and we are once again in the coalition building process. Now, Bennett's party, Yamina, back then it was called the New Right, now it's called Yamina, did manage to pass the threshold in all of the other elections, which is why he is back in the game now. But it's pretty crazy to think that he went from not getting into the Knesset and being fired from the cabinet for having not enough political support to reaching a situation where he's going to be prime minister as of next week, probably, because in all the craziness of Israel, we still don't actually know when the vote to bring in the government is going to take place, but probably on Wednesday. So how did this happen? The results of the last election basically, well, actually, I'll back up a little bit before. During the election campaign, Bennett had a pretty smart strategy where he didn't explicitly endorse Netanyahu, but he also didn't go against Netanyahu. So there was another party on the right that's sort of called the New Hope. It's led by Gidon Sar, who had been a Likud minister for a long time. He got on Netanyahu's bad side and felt that he probably won't be able to do so well in Likud as long as Netanyahu is around. So he took a break from politics for what ended up being 5 years. But then he realized, who knows when Netanyahu's leaving, and he came back for the 2019 election. And again, Netanyahu sort of, when he built his unity government, he didn't give Gideon Sa'ar a cabinet post, despite him doing very well in the Likud primary and being a very popular figure in Likud. Gideon Sa'ar broke off before this last election and started his own party, New Hope. Now, his party ended up with 6 seats. Bennett's Yamina party ended up with 7 seats, but Gideon Sa'ar didn't have the strategy that Bennett had. From the get-go, Gideon Sa'ar said, I'm very right-wing. Most of my policies are what the Likud policies have been over the years, even though they've changed a bit in the past couple. Likud has changed in the past couple of years, and Sa'ar didn't sort of go along with those changes. But he is against Netanyahu. He believes that Netanyahu is putting his own personal interests and legal interests before this country's interests. And so they broke off from Likud. And they said, we will not be in any government with Netanyahu. Bennett and the Yamina party, on the other hand, said, Netanyahu's done a lot of good things as a prime minister. We're a right-wing party and we'd like a right-wing government. But after 4 elections, basically one after the other, we think that the good of the country is for there not to be another election. And so we are not promising that we'll sit with Netanyahu, but we are also not promising that we won't sit with Netanyahu. In the end, neither Bennett nor Sa'ar did as well in the election as polls had projected, say, a month before the election. In the weeks before, you could see that there was a downturn. But Bennett ended up in this strong kingmaker position because neither the pro-Netanyahu bloc nor the anti-Netanyahu bloc could form a government. But the tricky thing is that neither of them could form a government even if they had Bennett with them. Neither of them reached 61 of 120 seats with Bennett. They would also need outside support. So Bennett was sort of the kingmaker, but there was a second kingmaker, which is not usually what happens when you're building a coalition. There's usually just one. So the second kingmaker was Mansour Abbas, who's the head of the Ra'am party. Ra'am is a party that's affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. That's in Egypt and a bunch of other affiliates around the Middle East. And they're affiliated with Israel's Islamist movement, which is split into north and south of Israel. But that's the southern part of Israel, which tends to cooperate more with the Israeli government, whereas the northern Islamist movement boycotts Israeli electoral politics entirely. So the southern movement, they've had a party in the Knesset for a long time. They were part of what's called the Joint List since 2013, which is when all the Arab parties decided to run, since 2015, when the 4 different Arab parties that were in the Knesset decided to run as one bloc, which was a good strategy because they got more seats. The sum is greater than the whole of its parts, as they say. But in 2020, Ram broke off from the rest of the Joint List because they wanted greater sort of civic participation, not just to be elected to the Knesset, but to really be part of the process, to cooperate with the coalition and to be stronger advocates for their constituents and for the Arab population of Israel. There was another break, honestly, on gay rights. They are an Islamist party and they don't support any bills on gay rights. And the biggest Arab party in the Knesset is a communist party, and they are supporters of gay rights. So there was a rift over that. But the big rift in the end, because I think they could have gotten along on that and said, okay, we'll give people freedom to vote according to their conscience instead of, using the party whip, so to speak. And the big rift in the end was that Mansour Abbas, the head of the Ram party, said, I don't love Netanyahu, but if I have to work with Netanyahu in order to get better things for my constituents on civil issues, whether it's infrastructure or better policing or better education, then I'll do it. And the Joint List took a more ideological stance and said no. So Abbas was in a situation where basically he would go with any government that was formed, right or left. So he also was in sort of a kingmaker position. But the truth is that he was, as long as certain basic things were given to him, he would have gone either way. Bennett tried to work with Netanyahu and negotiate with Netanyahu. But the other side, led by Yesh Atid's leader Yair Lapid, first of all, gave Bennett a better offer. And second of all, Netanyahu had a problem, which is that the farthest right-wing party in the Knesset which is called the Religious Zionist Party. I'm a religious Zionist. I do not feel this party represents our entire population in Israeli society, but that is the name of their party. They're a bloc made up of a bunch of far-right parties, including the racist Kahanist party called Otzma Yehudit. So they, on the far right, were unwilling to be in a coalition with Mansour Abbas because they said he is an anti-Zionist. He does not believe that Israel should be a Jewish state, which is true. He does not. And so they took that sort of ideological stance, the flip side of the joint list of the other Arab parties, that they were not willing to work with Mansour Abbas. And Bennett repeatedly said to Netanyahu, you don't actually have a coalition. If I agree to go with you, you're not really going to have a majority. Lapid, on the other hand, did. Lapid sort of systematically went to every single party that didn't want Netanyahu to be prime minister and signed agreements with them, which cabinet posts they'll have, what policies their government should promote, came to Bennett with this series of agreements and said to Bennett, all you need to do is agree to join. You can be prime minister for the first 2 years, and then Lapid will be prime minister for the next 2 years. This government is ready. You'll make the majority. And so Bennett agreed to join. Now, there was a bump in the road during the fighting, the mini war between Israel and Gaza that happened last month. Bennett, there were sort of anonymous leaks to the media, sources close to Bennett saying that he stopped negotiating. He's not so sure what to do because, there's this war going on. He's not sure that he wants to be in a government that is dependent on the Islamists who, like Hamas, are all affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Although, to be fair, Mansour Abbas really is not Hamas. He's really come a very long way for his party and his movement. But in the end, it was a tactic. Because what happened was, in all this time, all the members of Bennett's party were facing a ton of public pressure from right-wing people. They would show up to synagogue on Shabbat and people would hound them. There would be protesters outside their house. But once that leaked to the media, things calmed down a little bit and there was less pressure. And then he was able to quietly negotiate behind the scenes. And so that brought us to where we are today. They have this agreement where Bennett, with his 7 seats, is probably going to be prime minister in a few days. 7 seats that are really 6 seats, though, because I mentioned all that pressure. So first of all, there's one rebel in Bennett's Yamina party who is completely opposed to this government that's going to be formed. So the government, as we mentioned earlier, it has 3 right-wing parties, 2 centrist parties, 2 left-wing parties, and 1 Islamist party. So many on the right, Likud has more seats than those other 3 right-wing parties put together. And really many people on the right think, oh, this government is not really going to be right-wing. It's going to be dominated by the left-wing and centrist parties, and they oppose it. So this member of Bennett's party, his name is Amichai Shikli, he opposes it as well, and he says he's going to vote against it. And once he's a pretty anonymous backbencher. And I think sort of once his name got out there and he became this quote unquote hero of the right, he started saying more and more outlandish things. But in any case, what matters is that he's going to vote against this government. So Bennett is actually left with only 6 people. And there's really huge amounts of pressure on 2 other Knesset members from his party who people think they might be able to crack them. Basically, all of this is to say that the vote is expected to be on Wednesday, but we're not even sure. It could be next week. And Netanyahu is pulling out all the stops, and his supporters are putting as much pressure on as possible to make sure that this government doesn't go through. I think that there is like a 90% chance that this government will go through. It will be voted in, probably on Wednesday, but maybe next week. But you never know. Back in 1990, Shimon Peres told the president at the time that he had a government, and between that and the vote in the Knesset, he didn't have a government anymore, and Yitzhak Shamir became prime minister. So it's the only time in Israel's history that that's happened, but it could happen again. So, things are still crazy here. Now, as far as the prospects of this government, it is so varied. That it's hard to know what they'll agree on. They've already said pretty much publicly, it's not like the Palestinian Authority has some sort of, is about to make some sort of huge concessions to Israel, that like a two-state solution is on the table. So at the moment, they're just not going to deal with that because, there are at least 2 of the 8 parties in the coalition oppose it. The third right-wing party, Yisrael Beiteinu, is sort of, technically they want a two-state solution, but it's in a way that nobody else wants it. So it's hard to say they count. But so that's something they clearly don't agree on. That's like the most obvious and blatant thing. And so they're going to put that aside. But the truth is that they agree on very little. I mean, the head of Meretz is a gay man, and he's said that he's going to have to some extent, put their focus on gay rights, which has been something very important for Meretz, the far left party, aside, because there's an Islamist party in their coalition that's not going to let any of those laws pass. And to be honest, it's not just the Islamist party, also Yisrael Beiteinu, which has an older former Soviet Union immigrant base, which is also not, they're not anti-gay maybe, but they're not enthusiastic supporters of those changes, which could have been passed if not for those 2 parties, I would say. So, that's just one of many examples. Or, Bennett is very much a capitalist, on the border of libertarian, maybe. Maybe I'm exaggerating, because from an Israeli perspective, like the spectrum of capitalist to socialist is like very off compared to Israel. It starts in a very socialist place, I would say, or a more social democratic place. But Bennett is very far to the right economically, especially for an Israeli. And Meretz is very far to the left, and so is Labor. I mean, it's right there in their name, Labor. So they say, oh, we want to pass a budget fast. And in Israeli law, they're supposed to pass a budget within 100 days. Otherwise, there's another election. And that's written into the law. So, I don't know how easy it'll be for them to pass a budget. They're talking about specific things they want to focus on, education, post-corona recovery for small businesses and employment, because unemployment was the lowest of all time when corona started. And now it is twice as big. So it's still not huge, because twice of the lowest of all time is not massive unemployment, but it's still something that Israel wants to and clearly can improve. So these are sort of little things that they can focus on. I wrote an article yesterday about Yair Lapid likely being the foreign minister, because I cover international affairs most of the time. I think that they'll agree on a lot of those things. I mean, certainly there is I would say, consensus of most of the Knesset, including most of this coalition, that they oppose the Iran deal, for example. But the controversy is sort of whether Netanyahu's abrasive style, although I would say his style was more abrasive in 2015 than it is now, because he gets along fairly well with Biden, and I think they're talking more behind the scenes than the first time the Iran deal was on the table. But either way, so that's the kind of policy when it comes to Iran, or these attacks by the Mossad and the IDF, these sort of quiet attacks that come out later. Those are the kinds of things that I think that they'll agree on and be able to put forward. But anything bigger than like maintenance, so to speak, I think will be really hard for them to do. And I don't think this government will last very long, because it's not just diverse in its views and ideologies. It's also a 61-seat coalition, which I can say.
Lahav, how long do you think it
Yes.
will last? How long do you think it will last? If you had to
I
make
think
a
they'll
prediction.
pass a budget. I think they'll pass a budget. That's in the first 100 days. Which brings us to September, which is all the Jewish holidays. That gives us another month. I would give it less than a year. I would give it until they have to pass their next budget.
Do you think
to the end of 2022, I would say.
Are there any developments where you think that they might actually surprise people and be able to get certain policy changes done that have been languishing for many years? Because, I mean, for example, this government right now, one of the things that we know, would not allow the Haredi parties in the government as well. So this could be so I'm wondering, even if there's not going to be a lot of, say, move on the foreign policy front, because you've got, Naftali Bennett, who is opposed to a two-state solution, even though you've got the majority, even though a lot of members of his coalition are for it. I'm wondering on the domestic front, how do you see things changing within Israel itself? Like like passing a budget with the lack of Haredim for the first time not in the government for 12 years. What are some of the ramifications of those developments?
So the Haredi issue is an interesting one. The secular right wing in Israel, with the exception of most Russian-speaking Israelis, tends to be very traditional when it comes to Judaism, and so they tend to not want to rock the boat so much when it comes to Haredim because they sort of feel this sort of warmth and connection. But I do think that there are things that they would be able to do. I think, for example, everyone in this coalition is sort of sympathetic to the whole issue of the Western Wall, the egalitarian section of the Western Wall. We could probably see progress on that. And I think that would be a really easy thing for them to do. And I'm sure that, like, Iraq, what is it? Some religious action center of the reform movement. I'm sure they'll immediately start talking to people about that, to get movement on that. There's Yesh Atid really wants to require Haredi schools to teach the core curriculum in Israel. Haredi boys don't really learn math after 5th or 6th grade. They don't learn English, they don't learn much science. And if somebody does want to get a job like that after they finish yeshiva when they're 23 or whenever, they just don't have, they have to go back to school. So back in 2013, when Yair Lapid was in government and there were no Haredim in government, that was one of the laws he wanted to pass, or he did pass. But then once the Haredim came back, they immediately reversed it. To me, it looks like that could happen again. To me, it looks like that's a law that everyone in the coalition would support. But if in a few years the Haredim are back in government, they might reverse it yet again.
So
kinds of things. Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Now, some of the bigger religious and states issues, such as ultra-Orthodox enlistment in the IDF. I think that's like too dramatic, and they're not going to get that done. I'm not entirely sure where Naftali Bennett or Gideon Sa'ar would sit on that issue. So I think that's like too much of a hot potato, and they're not going to touch it. Things like abolishing the rabbinate or creating sort of a freer market of religion, I don't think that they want that.
It seems from what you're saying, Lahav, that there seems to be there might be some incremental approaches on some domestic things that everybody can agree on socially, but there's not going to be any dramatic foreign policy forays, So my question to you is, if, let's say, the idea, the thought of Bibi not being the prime minister of Israel, for those of us who've gotten used to seeing him every day for the past 12 years, is probably just a psychological shift in Israel and for everybody. Let's say if Likud goes into opposition, let's say this government does follow a 90% chance and gets approved. Let's go with your odds and say that it gets approved. Will the Likud party keep Bibi as the head of the opposition? And how hard is he going to work to bring down that government?
So I have to tell you that I'm doing this call with my phone set up on a tripod. And as I was talking, I saw a push notification at the top of my screen, which said that Yuli Edelstein plans to run against Netanyahu for leader of Likud. And Yuli Edelstein is currently the health minister, and he was Knesset speaker
and a Russian immigrant,
7 years.
Russian
Not
immigrant?
just a Russian immigrant, he was one of the most famous refuseniks.
Refuseniks, right.
You see a lot of you see pictures of the protests to free Soviet Jewry, and his name and his face are on a lot of them. On a lot of the signs that are in those. So
look, as your push notification is telling you. So okay, so let's say they go into opposition. How popular of a figure is Yuli Edelstein? Does he have a chance against Bibi? Do you think that the elders of Likud are going to say, okay, Bibi, it's time to go, or do you think they're going to stick by? Because Likud has had very few. They've had 4 leaders in their history, and the question is, are they going to dump Bibi, or are they going to go? What do you think is going to happen within the Likud party if they go into opposition?
So I think it's really interesting. Overall, over time, I've resisted comparisons between Netanyahu and Trump. But looking at Trump right now, I think is instructive. It's interesting to see like what Trump is doing because I think that um, while I think that Netanyahu far more qualified than Trump was, and in many ways, more suited to lead. I think I'm not going to get into Trump too much. I do think that there's a certain cult of personality that developed around Netanyahu, especially in the last few years, that is comparable to what has happened with the Republican Party and Trump, and the fact that he still has this hold on them, even though he lost the election, he's not president anymore. And so I don't know for sure that that will happen in Israel, but I suspect because I see, especially in the like right wing pro Netanyahu media, the way that they talk about like what Bennett did is not legitimate, that he's ran as the right wing and now he's going in a government that's with the left wing, and suspiciously sounds like stop the steal to me, even though I don't think there's going to be any violence, but I think for both Trump and Netanyahu that over time that hold will loosen. And so maybe there won't be a leadership challenge to Netanyahu in the second half of 2021, but it'll come soon enough. For
What
now
about,
though,
let
yeah.
me ask you, what about the fact that the head of the Shin Bet actually, who rarely speaks publicly, went ahead and announced that they were concerned at the level of vitriol in over politics, and was warning that this is not too far off from the 1995 atmosphere to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. I mean, has the public reacted? I mean, we hear all these stories about one of the female elected officials from Meretz being followed by cars throughout the day, her children being harassed in school, and people on the right
This is
harassing the
from
left.
Yamina. It's
From
from
Yamina,
Yamina.
from Yamina,
Well,
people
there's
on.
two, yeah, Bill,
Uh,
and I'll tell you why, because I find in politics that the people who have small differences between each other are often the nastiest to each other. So it's people on the right to other people on the right, of the pro BB right and the willing to sit without BB right, that is really bad right now.
I mean, what has been the Israeli public's reaction to the announcement of the Shin Bet about the vitriol? I mean, clearly nobody wants to get to a point where anybody gets hurt or there's violence, but that has to be a warning. That has to be a warning signal to people to just keep calm. I mean, one thing that I heard that which I thought was very interesting is Naftali Bennett acting like a statesman. I think he's been he. I mean, he just recently said, it came out in the papers that he said to Bibi, it's time to let go. It's time to let Israel go about. I mean, is he rising to the challenge, Naftali Bennett, after the Shin Bet warning? And what are Israelis thinking about it in general?
The first thing is I want to point out the Shin Bet statement didn't actually mention Rabin's assassination, although it did say that incitement can lead to people being killed. But I think it's pretty obvious that for a lot of Israelis they had that association, right, with Rabin. Um, the the reaction has been mixed. I mean, in Israel, the sort of far right and the like pro Netanyahu media, which is about like there's a newspaper, radio channel, and TV station that I would say that are like explicitly pro Netanyahu as opposed to just right wing. Um, they're like they're hysterical. I mean, I hate to use that word, but I just, to me, like I look at it and they're just in this total panic, and I think that really foments this really negative atmosphere. Netanyahu himself, I don't think he's inciting violence in the things he said, but he's on the attack, let's put it that way. I saw a columnist who I don't usually think is very extreme saying that Bennett is exhibiting sort of traitorous behavior, and what people do to
Traitorous,
traitors.
traitors.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So that's like, I think Bennett is rising to the occasion. I think that people in general, when they look at Bennett's past, they look at the fact that he's very, very right wing, on the Palestinian issue and on the settlements. But I think that overall, when it comes to within Israel, he's always spoken or tried to speak a sort of uniting, unifying kind of way. And he's continuing to do that. I think he has become a very polarizing figure. So it almost, I mean, he could make it worse, but it almost doesn't matter that he's rising to the occasion and saying the right things because the people who are angry at him are not going to listen to him.
So and if Naftali Bennett doesn't pull off this government and somehow the 10% of your prediction prevails, Naftali Bennett is finished in politics, right? I am guessing that if this doesn't happen, he has no home in the right, and the left will just reject him. I mean, if this government doesn't take place, Naftali Bennett is where?
I think you're right, although I think there's a possibility that he would merge with Gideon Saar's party and they would eke out some sort of small presence in the Knesset. But I think it would be pretty small for even if they combined forces.
So, what do you think? One of the things that we hear from the American Jewish community is that, and what this is, I mean, there are many good things we hear about Bibi and many negative things we hear about Bibi. One of the negative things we hear is that he has helped to dismantle the bipartisan consensus that Israel in the United States was always considered a bipartisan issue, and by aligning himself with Trump or with the Republican Party, that he has made it hard. He's made it harder for Israel to make its case among the Democrats in America. And unlike in Israel, we only have we only have two parties, and we go back and forth. My question is: do you think that if Bennett were to become prime minister, even though as you said he's maybe 10 degrees to the right of Bibi, do you think he will be in a position, or the change government will be in a position to improve relations with first the Biden administration, and secondly, what do you think about how it would relate with American Jewry?
Well, first of all, going back to Netanyahu, I think in the Obama years there was sort of a fair argument to be made that Netanyahu should be doing more to maintain his relationship with Democrats. I think to some extent in the Trump years, it wasn't fair. I mean, not that Netanyahu would have done it anyway, but it wasn't fair when people said, "Oh, he's too close to Trump." I mean, Netanyahu's job is to look out for Israel's interests. Trump was willing to basically do whatever Netanyahu thought was in Israel's interest. Like he shouldn't have taken advantage of that. So, like I think
I'm not offering a judgment. I'm just offering an evaluation.
Yeah, so I think there is something to the argument that Netanyahu hurt the bipartisan support for Israel, but I think there are parts of the argument that I think any Israeli prime minister would have taken advantage of what Trump was offering. Now Bennett, I think that first of all, I think that Netanyahu has become this sort of boogeyman for a lot of people, especially on the left, on liberals and progressives. From my sort of analysis of American politics, I don't think it matters who will be prime minister of Israel because, excluding Meretz, who I can't see them being prime minister in the near future, any realistic prime ministerial candidate is not going to be good enough for the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but perhaps the more moderate wing or the wing that's more sympathetic to Israel. I think that Netanyahu not being there anymore will help, because they see him just as a bad actor. And even if Bennett is to the right of Netanyahu, the Biden administration and a lot of the Democratic Party will want to hear him out. Also, the fact that this is such a varied coalition, and the fact that they're not really going to be able to do much as far as the Palestinian issue is concerned, it puts the tension sort of aside, right? Like that's going to be the area where Naftali Bennett and Joe Biden, I think, would disagree the most, and that's not going to come up as much. Although
if I can just interrupt 1 second, Lahav. To our participants out there, if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to post one in the question and answer boxes. Thank you. Continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I did see shortly before we began our talk that one of the things in the coalition agreement apparently is going to be a lot of construction in Jerusalem as opposed to in the settlements. That might cause some tension with the Biden administration because, again, this was right before I came on the call, so I couldn't really look at the details, but I assume Jerusalem includes East Jerusalem, which is fairly mainstream in Israel. It's not a right-wing position to think that is all of Jerusalem is sovereign Israel. Um, but it's not necessarily the Biden administration position. So there is potential for some tension there, but I don't think that's unique to Naftali Bennett.
Let me ask you a question. What about the possibility of something surprising happening? Something about Bennett has shown, has been shown that Lapid is now my dear friend Lapid, and somebody asked me the other day about a Nixon goes to China moment. In other words, that all of a sudden,
Or an Ariel Sharon moment.
or El Sharon moment, or a Begin goes to Ir, Sadat comes to Jerusalem moment, where some moment
Yeah.
where there's actually where the Palestinian Authority actually believes now there's an opportunity for a two-state solution, even with the former head of the council, who actually was in Ra'anana, it was near Tel Aviv, but goes ahead and is willing to go ahead and potentially stake out a two-state solution. I mean, let's face it, this is going to be the most, even if Naftali Bennett is in charge of the government, the people who are keeping him behind with the most seats with Gantz and Lapid favor a two-state solution. So might there be an opportunity here that a magical moment that we might foresee with a couple of akudniks on the left side breaking in favor of a two-state solution agreement? Is there any possibility there? Any interesting scenarios you can foresee coming?
I mean, it's like speculation on top of speculation, so it's hard for me to say. But if
That's what makes
anyone
this
were to
fun, though.
sort of right, if anyone were to break ranks, looking at historic precedents, it probably wouldn't be Likudniks, it would probably be Shas, because Shas helped the Oslo Accords pass through the Knesset by abstaining. So if anyone in that pro-Netanyahu bloc could make it happen, I would guess it was Shas.
Interesting, because they've indicated in the past that they, for the sake of protection of life,
Peace.
they might be able to go.
Yeah.
We have a question here. Can you please speak a little bit about Benny Gantz? He is going to stay defense minister.
Yeah, Benny Gantz is going to stay defense minister. There's a report that came out today that sort of said that sources close to Gantz, which probably just means Gantz himself, told the reporter that Gantz has been saying that he is the carpet on which Bennett and Lapid are walking to replace Netanyahu, which is an interesting metaphor, but I think it's true. I think if Gantz hadn't agreed to be in this unity government with Netanyahu, he sort of propelled things forward, put this scenario into action. So
how do you think most Israelis
yeah.
feel about Benny Gantz being defense minister? Are they confident with him in that role? Do they feel that Israel's security is being obviously he's a former head of the former head of the Israeli military of the IDF, but do Israelis feel good about him in that role? Do they feel confident with him in that role?
So it's actually really interesting. His public approval ratings went up a lot after this last round of fighting with Gaza, which compared to previous rounds of fighting, I don't think that it was so qualitatively different. It was sort of condensed, right? It was like the things that happened normally would have happened over a longer amount of time, but I don't think it was so different than previous rounds. But people seem to be very happy with him. And so, right. He'll continue being defense minister.
So he may be the carpet that they walked
right.
on, but he also may be a very secure carpet that keeps the country, maybe a secure fabric that keeps the country feeling good.
Right.
A couple interesting questions. Do you think there might be any changes on marriage and divorce laws? Maybe a civil opportunity with so many Israelis who go abroad to get married because they don't want to be married by the rabbinate? Do you think there might be some alternatives in that area in the social arena?
I think that this is a place where they're not going to be able to do anything because there's going to be too much friction within the coalition. The left wing and centrist part of the government wants that. Lieberman wants it, but not for gay couples. And the right wing parties, I think, are not going to want to do it. I think it's going to be too much of a disconnect from the rabbinate for them.
Another question: how will the new government, assuming again it was all operating on the basis that the change movement takes over, how does it affect Netanyahu's prosecution for crimes? Potential. Well, actually, there is a prosecution. How would it impact his prosecution? Right.
So Netanyahu has sort of operated on the theory that if he's prime minister, the verdict, a guilty verdict, would have such a huge impact on the country that it would that it sort of makes it less likely, if he is in a less prominent role. So if you buy into that theory, I guess it's more likely that the judges, it's one less thing the judges have to take into consideration. I don't buy that theory. So I don't really think that it's going to change anything in a significant way.
Do you think that actually here's a good question. How do you think this new government, again, even though I think it was Bennett who said he's 10 degrees to the left of Bibi. I don't know if he said it or somebody
To the right.
To the right of Bibi. Even though the consistency of his coalition is more left wing, so it obviously has a dramatic impact on what he can do. How do you see relations potentially changing or improving, or what do you think will be the impact on relations between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan, and also on the Gulf stage, which it's on the Abrahamic Accords? And
so I think each of those is a different answer. I think Egypt will probably stay the same. I think that ties between Israel and Egypt have really improved in the last few years, and it's based on energy cooperation with the gas. Israel's become a gas exporter. Egypt uses Israeli gas for its energy. And they've formed what's called the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which is them, the Palestinian Authority, Greece, Cyprus. I believe that France and Italy are in there, maybe just France. I don't remember all the countries, but they, are cooperating on the field of energy a lot. And it seems to have worked very well now with this conflict in Gaza, where Egypt, it's not the first time that Egypt has played a mediator, but I think they're taking a more active role now. And I don't think that depends on the specific individual in power in Israel. In Egypt, it does depend on their sort of stable situation, because when they had the Muslim Brotherhood in charge, there was no talking with Israel. But I don't think anybody sees that happening there. In Jordan, Netanyahu and King Abdullah have a terrible relationship, really, really bad. I don't know that the relationship will be better with Bennett. King Abdullah likes to flex his muscles at Israel because his population is, I believe, 80% Palestinians, and they basically hate Israel. So he likes to talk tough to Israel. So I don't know if it'll improve, but I think that there is maybe some hope, because he doesn't want anything to do with Netanyahu. The Abraham Accord countries, or Gulf states, I would say, the UAE, Bahrain, and then there's also Saudi Arabia, which has not entered the Abraham Accords, but has been taking sort of baby steps towards normalization with Israel. I think that there will be a brief sort of negative impact of Netanyahu's departure, because I think that there are a lot of personal relationships there and a lot of trust that's been built slowly over time. And they will want to see sort of what is going on in Israel now. As far as the UAE and Bahrain are concerned, especially the UAE, there's just so many business ties that, the train is moving full speed ahead no matter what. Diplomatically, there might be a slowdown until sort of the leaders get talking again. And on Saudi, I think that there was a real relationship between Bibi and MBS, a sort of secret relationship. It was definitely hurt when in November it was leaked that they had met in person. But I think that there was some trust there, and that MBS is really the guy in charge. There's also an issue just that everybody has changed that had to do with the Abraham Accords. The Trump administration isn't there, and there are certain figures, Avi Berkowitz, Jared Kushner, who took a real personal role in pushing this forward. The head of the Mossad in Israel just changed, and he also was very involved. So I think that, and then those countries are not democracies. So, their people in charge are
there's
always
also a report in the United States that former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Dan Shapiro, may be taking a new role in the U.S. administration centered in the Middle East, and he was, and that may, and part of expanding the Abrahamic Accords might be part of his portfolio. So, and
well, that would be great.
That would be it'll be interesting. That's a role we really don't know, but it's an interesting role. It was just talked about. So,
and he would be really good at it. Yeah,
exactly. And a lot of us who are sort of Israel followers, Zionists, and activists are looking to see what he would play. Two questions. Combined, What role do you think this new government will play? Will let me preface it. Obviously, one of the most things that stunned, I think, observers of Israel was the violence that took place within Israel,
Yeah.
between that upset Arab-Jewish coexistence, which had basically been. I mean, there's always been disparities, but that was basically on a low flame and that erupted into violence. Do you think this new government is in a position to address that inside of Israel? And the second part is, even though annexation obviously will not take place with this government because the way the way it's composed. But do you think there might be changes for improvement for Palestinians in the conditions on the ground in the Shtachim, in the territories?
Okay, so to the second question, do I think there'll be changes for the Palestinians on the ground? Bennett has long believed in what's called economic peace, sort of improving the quality of life for Palestinians in order to disincentivize them to be violent against Israel, even though he doesn't believe in a two-state solution. So it is definitely possible. I think that that's, something that maybe Lieberman would object, but I think that overall that's something that this government could put forward. Sort of more economic cooperation. I think the problem at the moment is though that the Palestinians have this war crimes case against Israel in the International Criminal Court, and it basically makes no one in Israel really want to work with them beyond what's necessary. I mean, at the moment, our foreign minister Gabi Ashkenazi is not right wing. He's from Gantz's Blue and White Party. He's leaving politics though, but in every meeting that I cover between him and another foreign minister, and there's actually a lot of foreign ministers visiting Israel lately, he says to them that we can't have a dialogue with them as long as they are trying to put us all on trial for war crimes. So I think that has to be solved first, and I'm not really sure what the horizon is on that. I forgot the first part of your question.
Oh, the first part is about conditions inside of Israel, and the second question was the first was in the second part was conditions for Palestinians in the territories, and the first part of the question was about improving conditions for Israeli Arabs.
Right. So I think the violence was really shocking for a lot of Israelis, including myself, right? We're used to all these rounds of fighting with Hamas one after the other, but this was really, it wasn't just violence in the sense of, violence is bad enough, but the fact that they were sort of torching synagogues just seemed deeply symbolic. And it was painful to see, especially in a time when it looked like there was going to be really great cooperation between Arabs and Jews in politics. But luckily that cooperation went forward, and I hope that good things will come of it, and that will be an indication to more of the Israeli Arab population that we can work together. There's going to be an Arab minister in this government. It's Isawi Frej of the Meretz Party. He's going to be the Minister of Regional Cooperation, which used to be like kind of a nonsense cabinet post that you would just give to someone because you need to give them some sort of political post. But I think, we have 4 more countries in the region that have relations with Israel that, there could be something real to do with that. And to have an Arab minister in that post, I think could also give it greater significance. Mansour Abbas, head of the Ram Party, he is not going to be in the cabinet. My understanding is that it's because in Israel, legally and symbolically, if you're a minister in the cabinet, then you are responsible for anything that cabinet votes on. And that includes Israeli actions in Judea and Samaria, any conflicts with the Palestinians. So I think Mansour Abbas doesn't want to be part of that. But he will probably be chairman of the Knesset's Interior Committee, which includes policing, includes infrastructure. It also includes environmental issues, but that's less relevant to this point. And it's a very powerful committee post within the Knesset, and so I think it'll be very interesting to see what he does with that.
Here's an interesting question. I can't help but noticing that every single player in Israeli politics right now is male. Are there any women playing influential roles right now?
Yes, it looks like there are going to be 8 women in the cabinet, which will be a record. It is 8 out of 23. So it
8
could
of the
be could
23
improve,
women in the Knesset will be in a
but
cabinet
in the
position?
cabinet. Eight of the 23 cabinet members will be women. I
Oh, we
believe
have the
that there's
23 members.
40 women in the Knesset,
40,
but
there's 40 women in
I'm
the
not,
Knesset.
something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, in 2015, the record was beat and it was like 38 or something like that. And then in these 4 elections, it's just been like going up and down, like around that number.
So it's about
But
a
as far as the
third women.
cabinet,
About
yeah.
a third women. Okay.
Yeah, and you have to think that there are the 2 Haredi parties don't have women in them.
Right.
But anyway, in this count, first of all, the leader of labor, Merav Michaeli, not only is a woman, she is, before being in politics, was probably Israel's most famous radical feminist. She speaks in, Israel's Hebrew's a language that has a feminine and a masculine, and she speaks in the feminine all the time. Even if she's talking to, because you're supposed to speak in the masculine when you speak to a group of people, and she speaks in the feminine, and she has like a thing that she invented that actually a lot of like progressive organizations have picked up on, where you, instead of speaking in male as the default, you sort of write out this male / female way of writing. Anyway, that's just symbolic. That's sort of her thing. But the planned education minister is a woman. The planned interior minister, which is a very powerful position, is a woman. The planned environmental protection minister is a woman. Merav Michaeli, the head of labor, I think is going to be housing minister, but I'm not positive. There's supposed to be several other women. I don't remember everything off the top of my head.
Well, I've got to tell you, Lahav, you're doing great, because we have more participants now than we did when we started the phone call. So, I mean,
Wow.
You're really maintaining that. And somebody mentioned Ayelet Shaked also.
Yeah, so Ayelet Shaked is supposed to be interior minister.
So I wanted to ask you, are there any one person was concerned and said, was the presence of the Islamic Party will hinder the ability of the IDF or to make any strategic decisions that it needs to? Is that an issue?
So that is a big right-wing critique of this government. I think the fact that they're not taking any cabinet posts, I think, means that it probably won't affect it in any way.
Because it's being done by the security cabinet that makes all those decisions, right? As a subset. And
yeah, not just the security cabinet, but even in the full cabinet, they're not taking any ministerial positions. The most senior position that the Ram party is taking is chairman of the Interior Ministry, of the Interior Committee in the Knesset.
So before we close, are there any last minute thoughts that you'd like to, where would you rate yourself? Pessimistic, optimistic? Where do you think, I'm not asking you your own political views. I mean, your own political views, you have to remain passionate as a reporter, as a journalist, but any closing thoughts for this was a lot of fun and extremely interesting.
Well, 2 things. First of all, I am an optimist. And I always think that there is room for things to get better. We're going to go on to higher and better things. I don't think, whether you support Netanyahu or not, I think that Israel is greater than one person, and that we will be fine, and we will continue to be great. I also think, I also just want to mention that we have a new president. That hasn't come up at all. People don't care that much about the president of Israel.
Herzog, yes.
Right. So Isaac Herzog is going to replace Rivlin next month. He was just elected last week. The Knesset votes for the president. And he was the leader of the Jewish Agency for the past few years, which I think is a really good sort of role to segue into being the president, because the president is supposed to be sort of a uniting figure. It's supposed to be sort of above politics. And I think I know he has very close ties with American Jews. He attended my high school alma mater many years before me, but the Ramaz High School.
Everybody whose high school he went to is quoting credit for his.
Totally.
Is quoting credit for his rise to the presidency right now. I know.
They sent a fundraising email to all the alumni after he was elected. Right. He also went to Cornell, so I don't know if they're fundraising on that. But he lived in America for less time than Netanyahu, but quite some time while his father was Israel's ambassador to the UN. So understands U.S. Jewry, both from having lived here and both from being with the Jewish Agency, which is, deals with diaspora affairs.
Lahav,
And yeah.
let me ask you one question about that. When Shimon Peres was president, he was often, I think, set off to keep world Jewry and was used as the great public face of Israel because he was known as a man of peace, known as a person who, I mean, I remember the very funny videos about how, you had this 90-year-old president who was beloved by the youth of Israel for his vision and his idealism. And I'm just wondering that, do you think Herzog will himself could play a role because in the strengthening of relations between the U.S. Jewish community, American Jewish community, and Israel and the Biden administration? Because even though it's a largely ceremonial position, he does come from Israeli pedigree.
Yes.
With every, I mean, he's about Israeli Kennedy as much as you could get in terms of his pedigree. Do you think he might actually find himself working closely with the government and being able to provide more than a ceremonial role, but actually because and help Israel in its PR efforts and help Israel in its ability to strengthen its relationship with the American Jewish community and the American government?
I think so, but within limits. I think that he will serve as a good sort of additional ambassador, roving ambassador for Israel. I think that he will be able to speak well to the American community, not only for the reasons I listed before, but because he comes from the left. He's the moderate left of Labor. Labor has its sort of hawks and doves, and he's on the more moderate side, but he still is, at heart, a liberal, and most U.S. Jews are liberal, so they might feel sort of more comfortable or relate more to the things he talks about. I think he's limited by his own limited charisma. Not to be mean, I've known him for years now, and I like him very much as a person, but he's not like a compelling, charismatic speaker.
Right.
And Peres, you wouldn't think he would be, but he just, is someone who became a legend in his own time. So people were, excited to hear from him. And I don't think Herzog has that.
Right. Well, on that note, Lahav, I got to tell you, this was an absolutely fantastic, fabulous discussion. Your knowledge is just unbelievable, and your analysis was absolutely terrific. And I want to thank you very, very much. And thank you for joining us. Hopefully, we will have you again soon, and be able to talk with you again within the year or so. Within the year, because we'll see if the government lasts that long. We'll see if it actually gets in.
I would love to talk to you again, but I hope that it's not for another election anytime soon.
Well, we can speak for us about an analysis about what's going on with the government as opposed to elections about a new government. How does that sound?
Perfect.
Great. Well, look, Lahav, thank you very much. This was a fascinating discussion. Enjoyed every moment of it, and the box here is telling me about how much people enjoyed this conversation. So thank you very much, and we look forward to speaking with you again in the future.